Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to talk about destroying weapons and armor in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I was watching XPtoLevel3 the other week, and it was one of their Dungeon Delve episodes where they do sort of like a mockumentary style. Sometimes they'll finish it in one adventure, sometimes they won't finish it in one adventure, and they have to kind of spread it across 2 episodes. But they're kind of fun little videos, just, something that you can put on your second screen. There was one thing that happened in that episode that kind of caught my attention, and that was an enemy whose basically whole strategy was to break the player's weapons if they could. So we're going to get to that in a moment, but real quick, if you're a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, consider hitting that subscribe button either now or at some point during this video if you like what you see. But yeah, before I get started talking about destroying weapons and armor and how that works within 5th edition, I wanted to real quick play the clips from XPtoLevel3 so you have the context of where that's coming from, and then we'll kind of dig into all the details of it. But without further ado, here's the clip of what happened.
And Sir Brayford, who is not Sharwin's twin, but a different guy who came down here with them in their adventuring party who got caught up in the mess, has a weapon called a Shatter Spike. And this weapon can destroy other weapons. So even though that is your vow of enmity, he's gonna be like, nah, and he's gonna turn towards Argent. Argent, what are you currently wielding?
I am wielding a spear.
Sir Brayford targets your spear with his sword called Shatter Spike. Your spear has an AC, it's made of wood, so it has an AC of 15, and it's going to be a resilient object, so it has 10 hit points. He's using a one-handed attack. He gets a 15 in hits, deals 7 slashing to it, but Shatter Spike does double damage to objects. He hits your spear and breaks it into pieces.
That's crazy.
That's cool.
I learned through DMing this adventure that this is something you can do in the default rules. Shatter Spike is a special weapon because it does double damage to objects, but you can always just target somebody's weapon like in VATS and Fallout. Why do people do this more?
Yeah. Why don't we use them more often? And if you want to watch that episode, I'm going to link it down in the description below. It isn't quite a full actual play. They do skip through a lot of parts. They kind of do the highlights. They are kind of long videos, so if it is one of those things where you're kind of sitting down and kind of want to watch it on a second screen, or if that's something that you do like to sit down and watch, directly, you can do that too, of course. But yeah, can you destroy weapons in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? I know that's something that we don't normally do. With those clips behind us, let's actually dig into it and see how this actually works. So for the context of those videos, they were running the Sunless Citadel. This is one of the adventures in the anthology book of Tales of the Yawning Portal. The snip in front of you is the actual text from the actual adventure, where it says, Sir Brayford uses Shatter Spike, see Appendix A, to destroy his foe's weapon if possible. This is the only text in the adventure that describes this kind of interaction. Then I jumped to Appendix A to see what is special about this Shatter Spike weapon. So it says that Shatter Spike is a longsword. It is uncommon and requires attunement. You have a +1 bonus to attack and damage rolls you make with this magic weapon. So far, nothing's too crazy. And then it says if it hits an object, the hit is automatically a critical hit, and it can deal bludgeoning or slashing damage to the object, your choice. This is the main thing that allows it to be so efficient at breaking weapons or armor. In this case, the creature's strategy is specifically to target the weapons according to the text. In the video, they described it as dealing double damage to objects, which isn't necessarily true depending on how you adjudicate critical hits, whether you actually roll the dice or if you just roll one die and then double the result. There will be small differences there. But like I said, this is sort of the crux of the weapon that allows it to be so good at breaking weapons. There isn't a special action that it has that enables you to target and break a weapon. It is simply that it deals extra damage to objects. And also that it can deal either bludgeoning or slashing damage to an object, which may allow it to bypass certain resistances or maybe even special thresholds. The last sentence of this item says, further, damage from non-magical sources can't harm the weapon. Not only does it deal an automatic critical hit to objects, not only does the strategy of this creature in the text of the adventure itself say that he uses the weapon to destroy his foe's weapon, so you can attack a weapon. That is heavily implied here that is just a thing that you can do. But also the last sentence says that it is immune to non-magical sources of damage that wouldn't be necessary if weapons couldn't be damaged in the first place, right? So just based on this information alone from the module, we can see that it's heavily implied that yes, you could be targeting your enemies' weapons and armors if they're wearing armor as well. So I think this is interesting because it's always been sort of like a long-standing, unspoken rule that magic items are sort of indestructible in a way, unless there was something that specifically says that they could be destroyed. Even rust monsters, for example, can only target non-magical weapons. And this might come from the fact that the Dungeon Master's Guide says specifically that artifacts are indestructible and can only be destroyed in special ways. That is only for artifacts. It does not extend to just regular magic items, even legendary magic items. And maybe that's something that just we as players kind of just extended to the rest of the magic items. And maybe there's the narrative need as the DM to be able to describe this magical pristine set of armor amongst the rubble of a bunch of rusted and damaged sets of armor otherwise. Much like the old cartoons where like the fake part of the wall that would open up a secret door was very obviously colored differently than the rest of the wall. We kind of apply that same logic to magic weapons and armor in D&D a lot. And there's even a line in the player's handbook that says magic items may be indistinguishable from other items of their kind, or they might be obviously magical, or even when you pick them up, they'll sort of have a resonance of magic when you touch them. This is all to say that all magic items other than artifacts are basically as destructible as their mundane counterparts, with very little differences, but we'll touch on magic item durability a little bit later. But what are the actual rules around interacting and breaking objects? So let's take a look at the player's handbook and kind of dig into that. So digging into the player's handbook, again, this is in the exploration section. This is the first time that we see objects mentioned sort of in the player's handbook, or at least specific rules around objects. They had very similar, if not identical, rules in 2014. I'm just using 2024 because they're the most current. We have interacting with objects. It says, interacting with objects is often simple to resolve. The player tells the DM that their character is doing something, such as moving a lever or opening a door. The DM describes what happens. Sometimes, however, rules govern what you can do with an object, as detailed in the following sections. So first things first, what is an object? For the purposes of the rules, an object is a discrete, inanimate item like a window, door, sword, book, table, chair, or stone. It isn't a building or a vehicle, which are composed of many objects. So right off the bat, we can see that, of course, a sword, unsurprisingly, is an object. This could obviously be then extended to different kinds of armor, which, of course, unsurprisingly would also be a kind of object. So while we all already kind of knew this, of course, we can see that according to the rules, weapons are objects. So then down at the bottom of this interacting with objects section, there's the section for breaking objects. It says, as an action, you can automatically break or otherwise destroy a fragile, non-magical object such as a glass container or a piece of paper. If you try to damage something more resilient, the DM might use the rules on breaking objects as outlined in the rules glossary. Pretty simple so far. As an action, you can destroy any non-magical object that is considered fragile, such as, again, like it says, a glass container. You can just drop that on the ground and it'll shatter. A piece of paper, you can just rip it in half. But notably here, it does specify a non-magical object can be destroyed this way. For example, if you had the alchemist jug and you accidentally dropped it from your hands for whatever reason, it wouldn't shatter upon hitting the ground. So magic items are a little more resilient in that way, so that's interesting to point out. But what about these more resilient items? What does the rules glossary for breaking objects actually say? So jumping to the rules glossary, we have the first section here. It starts off pretty much spelling it right out that objects can be harmed by attacks and by some spells using the rules below. So you can use your attack to specifically attack a creature's weapon. You can use your attacks to specifically target a creature's armor, for example, either by using your weapon attacks or by using spells. And that is assuming that the spell is able to target an object, because not necessarily every spell is able to. I think most can. Although many AoE spells, as we know, don't deal damage to objects that are being worn or carried. But the rules go on to repeat that if an object is exceedingly fragile, the DM may allow a creature to break it automatically with an attack or utilize action. And then it has this handy table for the armor classes of different materials. So the armor classes start as low as 11 for things like cloth, paper, and rope. And then it goes as high as 23 for things made out of adamantine. I think the ones that are most relevant for weapons are going to be 15 for wood, 19 for iron and steel, 21 for mithril, and then of course 23 for adamantine. You could say that certain weapons like the sling or even the string on a bow could have an AC of 11. Although I feel like if you were targeting the string on a bow, that would require a higher AC because it's such a small target. And this isn't actually stated in the rules anywhere, but I feel like if you're trying to attack someone's weapon, that you should probably also add their dex bonus to the AC of the weapon, because it's not like they're just going to let you get a clean hit on the weapon. I feel like these ACs are more like the object is just sitting stationary on the ground and isn't a moving target. But that, of course, would be up for the DM to adjudicate. Likewise, I think this also falls apart a little bit with shields, unless you're being really mean about it as the DM, because, you know, shields are designed to be hit. So does that mean if you're using a shield and the attack misses that the shield was hit and therefore damaged? Or does it only take damage if the shield was specifically targeted with the attack? I think that latter part makes more sense, that it needs to be specifically targeted by the attack. Otherwise, it might just be like a glancing blow. But again, that is something that the DM would need to adjudicate as well. What I do like about this table, and I think that the ACs, make as much sense as they can. This feels like the first thing I've seen in the rules that it feels like it's actually trying to support some form of crafting system, or at least a sense of real gear progression. Because I feel like the common progression in games like this is that, you have your starting equipment and you carry that along with you. Later, you'll find a magic weapon and you'll continue carrying that with you. Maybe sometime before then you went to, an armor smith or a weaponsmith and got better gear, but eventually you find a magic one and then you just kind of carry that with you the rest of the adventure. Maybe if you go into higher tiers of play, you'll find upgrades and then you'll kind of retire your older weapons. But usually for shorter adventures, you know, things that don't go into, you know, higher tiers, you usually just find your first magic weapon and that's the one that stays with you for the rest of the time. Whereas this really incentivizes sort of player/character driven motivations. So let's say that I have my spear and it gets cut in half by a bugbear with an axe. Then I have to go back to town. Well, I need a new spear, but I also don't want that spear to be as fragile. So I had this money from my quest. I'm going to upgrade the spear such that it has an iron handle or a steel handle, so it's much harder to break. And then maybe even once I have a magical weapon, if I find one later on, maybe it could be improved in such a way that you could have it inlaid with mithril or adamantine later. And magic weapons are also subject to being destroyed. So at least from that perspective, it feels very cool. But what about the hit points of weapons? How much do they actually have? So moving on to the rest of the description of breaking objects in the rules glossary, goes on to outline hit points. It says an object is of course destroyed when it has 0 hit points. The hit point table below has suggested hit points for objects of tiny through large size for both fragile and resilient objects. For huge or gargantuan objects, it is suggested to divide them into large or smaller sections and track each of the hit points independently. So for example, if you had like a stone statue of a humanoid figure and one of their legs got broken, that might be enough to collapse the whole structure rather than having to destroy each individual section. We saw in the Dungeon Delve XPtoLevel3 video that they ruled that a spear was a small resilient object, which would give it the 10 hit points. That was just the average hit points suggested here. But it is a little surprising to me, a little eye-opening to me that the hit points are so low. I mean, it makes sense that they're so low because again, it is just a small wooden object, but it is again very eye-opening to know that these pieces of equipment, these armors and weapons that we carry with us are actually so fragile that if we were implementing, you know, weapon and armor destruction into our games, that it would be kind of so easy to destroy them. So on that topic then, do armors and weapons have any sort of built-in resistances or immunities? The rules go on then to describe damage types for objects. Objects have immunity to poison and psychic damage. That's pretty common. You've probably seen that before looking across like stat blocks or other things. It also says that the DM might decide that some damage types are more or less effective against an object. For example, bludgeoning works well for smashing things but not cutting. Paper or cloth might have vulnerability to fire damage, for example. And if you played 3.5, this kind of reminds me a lot of the thresholds that monsters had in that edition. And speaking of damage thresholds, the rules go on to describe damage thresholds. It says big objects such as castle walls often have extra resilience represented by a damage threshold. And if you don't know what a damage threshold is, it is basically a minimum amount of damage that must be done to a creature or object in order to deal damage to it at all. So for example, if a wall had a damage threshold of 20, if you dealt 19 or less damage to that wall, you deal no damage to that wall. If you deal 20 damage or more to that wall, then all of that damage goes through. So in the 3.5 edition, a lot of monsters had thresholds such that I would say like 10/bludgeoning, which meant that it had a damage threshold of 10 against all damage types except bludgeoning. And I think some system like that could be useful for things like armor or even weapons. It doesn't make sense that certain damage types would be necessarily effective against all kinds of armor or all kinds of weapons. But lastly, the breaking objects rules finishes with no ability scores. An object lacks any ability scores unless a rule assigns scores to that object. I think sentient weapons usually have some sort of ability scores. Some spells might assign ability scores to objects like the old animate objects did. I can't remember if the new one does as well. But without ability scores, an object of course can't make any ability checks, and it fails all saving throws. So of course that is a big reason that many area of effect spells exclude items that are being worn or carried from their areas of effect. Otherwise, not only would they be freely dealing damage to those objects, but they would also be automatically failing those saving throws and taking the full damage of that spell. And if that were the case, then players would be having to spend so much time stopping to repair all of their armors in between combats. So those are the rules that cover just kind of all the general items, but what about magic items specifically? If we want to know the rules for magic items, we have to look specifically into the Dungeon Master's Guide. So if you go into the section for treasure and you go under magic items, there's a subsection called magic item resilience. It says a magic item is at least as durable as a non-magical item of its kind. So for the spear example, a magic spear with a wooden handle would still have an AC of 15. It would still have at least the 10 hit points. You know, a DM might rule that any bonuses, like a +1 bonus to the spear, might also apply to its AC, so it'd go up to 16 instead of 15. You know, the DM is welcome to adjudicate that way, but it is at least as durable as its normal counterpart. And then it says that most magic items, other than potions and scrolls, have resistance to all damage. That's pretty good to know, although I don't know that scales very well into late game because they just have such low hit points and damage scales so quickly in 5th edition at least. If something wants to target your weapon and destroy it, they can, as long as they hit it. And then it continues to say that an artifact can be destroyed only in some special way. Otherwise, it is impervious to damage. Learning how to destroy an artifact usually requires research or completion of a quest. So those were all the same rules that existed in 2014 as well. This is nothing new. So the only real difference between a magical item and a non-magical item is that magical item essentially is isn't considered fragile such that it can't be instantly broken just as an action, as we described earlier in this video. And they also just have a blanket resistance to all damage. So all of these rules clearly outline the fact that yes, weapon and armor are very much destructible if you want to, but is it really worth it? What are the pros and cons of actually using these systems in your game? So the pros I think would be, as I mentioned before, it does provide player/character driven incentive for crafting and seeking gear progression rather than just relying on what the adventure module or the DM puts in the loot tables. Finding loot is still very fun. I don't think that's something that should be removed from the game, but especially early on when you're just dealing with mundane weapons, you know, moving on from a wood weapon to a steel weapon to a mithril weapon to an adamantine weapon is a nice sense of progression. And again, even if you do find a magic item, maybe that magic item is still made of wood, and maybe there's a way that you can still reinforce it with things like adamantine or mithril to make it harder to break. I think it also incentivizes carrying multiple weapons and using those different masteries that we now have in 2024. It gives the mending cantrip an actual purpose in the game. I don't think I've ever actually seen it being used for any real purpose. It's always been like a very flavor-based cantrip. The only exception would be like the artificer, who can use it to mend their construct, or at least they currently can. They are thinking about removing that in the revised artificer. We'll have to wait and see how that works out. I think it also can make combat feel more dynamic and possibly create huge advantages, especially against heavily armored targets. You know, destroying full plate, for example, would increase the chance to hit that target very dramatically if they go from like an 18 AC to the 10 AC plus dex. And this is also just a monk buff, because monks don't need weapons and they don't need armor to function. So if you put weapon and armor destruction in your game, then being a monk just feels better. Some of the cons that I can think of off the top of my head is that this disproportionately affects martial characters who are kind of already disproportionately affected by a lot of the bad parts of the game, I guess is the way to put it. On the same note, this also disproportionately affects players, because players are usually the ones that have to wear armor. There's not a whole lot of natural armor. There are some species, of course, that do, some subclasses that, like the Draconic Sorcerer gets a base armor of some kind. Mage armor provides an armor without having actual armor on. The vast majority of players are also carrying weapons around in combat, or maybe their arcane focus, something along those lines. They have a thing that they need to use to do their thing in combat, whereas not all enemies have the same thing. They might have natural armor, they might have natural weapons. So these weapon and armor breaking rules are basically 100% of the time effective against players and much less frequently available against monsters. And on that same note, you can waste a whole lot of a wizard's time and money by destroying their spellbook. This is a discussion point that makes its round on the internet, you know, several times a year. It's where the whole idea of a wizard tattooing their spellbook on their skin comes from, because then you can't destroy their spellbook that way. Even if you do put in weapon and armor destruction into your game, I think destroying a wizard's spellbook is a huge jerk move, because it just, again, it wastes so much time and money to recreate their spellbook. And not only that, but when they do recreate their spellbook, they can only put in the spells that they had prepared the last time that they had their spellbook, because those are the only spells that they currently know and are able to transcribe. Basically, destroying a wizard spellbook would be a lot like just taking all of a sorcerer's meta magic away. It's kind of what the class is built on. I also think that item durability is usually people's least favorite part of any game. The popular examples that I can think of off the top of my head are like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Items eventually broke in that game no matter what, and I don't think I ever heard anyone say, yep, I want this in every game that I play. It was just something that we got used to and kind of had to work around. I also think that you can bring a dungeon crawl to a halt if you use this excessively against your players. However, I do think that might be like a fun dungeon crawl gimmick, especially at lower levels before you get magic items. You really kind of go after weapons and armor such that the characters are incentivized to pick up the weapons and armor of the creatures that they're defeating and kind of using that to make their way through the dungeon. That might be a fun like little one-shot thing to do. And as far as the base rules for it go, I think weapons and armor could use more details around specific resistances and thresholds for each kind of armor and each kind of weapon. This would require more prep work on the behalf of the DM. It doesn't make sense, for example, for, you know, a full plate of armor to be so easily pierced by a basic arrow, for example. And even though I described destroying full plate increasing the chance to hit a target very dramatically as a positive, I do feel like from a DM perspective, at least, I would probably want to homebrew this a little more such that destroying armor isn't such a binary swing in that way. You know, going from 18 AC to a 10 AC is a huge swing that I think would completely imbalance an encounter. I'd probably want to do something where like each point of AC above 10 is its own set of hit points. So like, let's say that a full plate of armor, you know, let's just give it the 10 hit points. So then it would basically have 80 hit points, and then for every 10 hit points it loses, their AC drops by 1 until they get to 10. And at that point, the armor is basically destroyed and unusable. I'd probably do something like that. So those are all the rules around breaking equipment in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. I'm very interested to know what all your opinions are about this. You know, if this is something that you were kind of already aware of and maybe you've used it previously in games, and how did that feel? If you've never done this before and never knew that this was actually possible, you know, what are your opinions about it? How do you think it would work? Do you think it would feel good, or what do you think would be necessary in order to make it feel like it's actually an interesting part of the game? Again, you can let me know all that down in the comments down below. And while you're going down to those comments, please hit that like button. If you are a new viewer or returning viewer to this channel and you like what you saw here and you want to see more, please consider hitting that subscribe button. It helps me out quite a bit. I release videos every Wednesday and Sunday, so you always have something to look forward to. I appreciate all of your time, and I'll see you in the next one.